The stranger arrived in Silver Creek, Nevada on a Tuesday morning when the desert wind carried more dust than hope. He drove a nondescript sedan with out-of-state plates, parked outside the abandoned building that had once housed Morrison's General Store, and began unloading boxes with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to establishing operational bases in hostile territory. Within a week, the empty storefront had been transformed into a small coffee shop with hand-painted signs and mismatched furniture that somehow felt more welcoming than anywhere else in the dying town. Nobody knew his real name, though he introduced himself simply as Joe when customers asked. He served excellent coffee, listened more than he spoke, and paid his bills in cash without complaint. The coffee shop opened precisely at 6 each morning and closed at 8 each evening, maintaining hours that suggested military discipline rather than small-town casualness. If you believe that heroes sometimes arrive quietly, without fanfare or recognition, bringing justice to places where hope has nearly died, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of those who serve in shadows. Silver Creek had been dying slowly for 20 years, ever since the copper mine that sustained the local economy had closed due to environmental regulations and depleted ore deposits. The population had dwindled from 3,000 to fewer than 300, mostly elderly residents who lacked the resources to relocate and younger families trapped by underwater mortgages on worthless property. But recently, something had changed in Silver Creek's slow decline toward abandonment. Marcus Webb, owner of Webb Mining Corporation, had returned with plans to reopen the copper mine using new extraction technologies that promised jobs and economic revival. The town council had welcomed Webb's investment enthusiastically, approving permits and tax incentives that would make the mining operation profitable while providing employment for local residents. Joe observed these developments from behind the counter of his coffee shop, serving coffee to miners, town officials, and longtime residents while listening to conversations that revealed the complex dynamics of a community caught between economic desperation and environmental concerns. Most residents supported the mining project because they needed jobs, but a small group opposed reopening the mine due to concerns about water contamination and environmental damage. The coffee shop became neutral ground where different factions could coexist peacefully, united by their appreciation for Joe's exceptional coffee and his apparent disinterest in local politics. He served everyone equally, mine supporters and environmental activists, town council members, and ordinary residents, without expressing opinions about issues that divided the community. But Joe's apparent neutrality concealed careful observation of power structures and relationships that would have been familiar to intelligence analysts trained in unconventional warfare. He noted which officials received special treatment from mine representatives, which permits were approved without normal review processes, and which residents seemed intimidated when discussing their concerns about the mining project. 3 weeks after Joe opened his coffee shop, the first acts of intimidation began. Martha Hendricks, 73 years old, widow of a Korean War veteran who died from lung cancer possibly related to his military service, owned a small house and 2 acres of land directly adjacent to the proposed mining site. Webb Mining Corporation needed her property to access the richest ore deposits, but Martha had refused their purchase offers because she wanted to remain in the home she'd shared with her husband for 40 years. Martha was a regular customer at Joe's coffee shop, arriving each morning at 7:30 for black coffee and a blueberry muffin while sharing stories about her late husband's military service and their life together in Silver Creek. Joe listened with the patience of someone who understood that elderly veterans' widows often had few people willing to hear their memories. Harold served 2 tours in Korea, Martha told Joe one morning, showing him a faded photograph of her husband in Army uniform. Came home and worked 30 years at the old mine before they shut it down. This house, this land, it's all we ever had, but it's ours. Nobody's going to force me out. Joe studied the photograph, recognizing the bearing of a combat veteran in Harold Hendricks's formal military portrait. Your husband sounds like a good man who served his country with honor. He was the best man I ever knew. Said a soldier's duty was to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. That's why I won't sell to Webb Mining. Not for any amount of money. This is where Harold's buried, and this is where I'm staying. But Marcus Webb and his associates weren't accepting Martha's refusal as final. Joe observed increased surveillance of Martha's property by mine security personnel, intimidating visits from Webb representatives who promised escalating consequences for continued resistance, and coordination between mine officials and local law enforcement that suggested corruption beyond simple business relationships. Sheriff Rick Coleman, a 20-year veteran of the Silver Creek Police Department, had been receiving regular payments from Webb Mining Corporation according to financial records that Joe accessed through methods learned during intelligence operations. Deputy Chief Brian Walsh and 3 patrol officers were also receiving monthly supplements to their official salaries in exchange for services that included harassing mine opponents and ignoring safety violations at the mining site. Joe documented this corruption systematically, using surveillance techniques and financial analysis to build comprehensive intelligence on the criminal conspiracy that was using intimidation and official authority to force local residents from their properties. But documentation alone wouldn't protect Martha Hendricks from escalating threats. Thursday morning, Martha arrived at the coffee shop with a black eye and bruises on her arms that she tried to conceal beneath long sleeves despite the desert heat. "Martha, what happened?" Joe asked, serving her usual coffee while noting injuries consistent with physical assault. "Had some visitors last night," she replied, her voice shaking slightly. "Mine security, they said. Told me I had 1 week to accept their purchase offer or face consequences for interfering with economic development." Joe's expression remained neutral, but something cold settled behind his eyes. "Did you report the assault to Sheriff Coleman?" "Called the sheriff's office, but they said it was a civil matter between me and the mining company. Said I should consider the generous offer Webb Mining made for my property." Joe understood immediately that local law enforcement was completely compromised by mining company corruption. Martha Hendricks had no official protection against escalating intimidation, and Webb Mining felt confident that they could use violence to force her compliance without legal consequences. "Martha, you might consider staying with friends or family for a few days until this situation resolves itself," Joe suggested carefully. "I'm not leaving my home. Harold and I built that house together, and I'm not going to be intimidated by thugs and corrupt police." Joe admired Martha's courage, but his military experience told him that elderly civilians were no match for organized criminal enterprises backed by corrupt law enforcement. Webb Mining would escalate their intimidation until Martha either sold her property or became a casualty of their economic development project. Friday evening, Joe closed his coffee shop and conducted surveillance of Martha's property using night vision equipment and tactical positioning learned during military operations. Webb Mining security had established observation posts around her house, clearly preparing for some kind of action that required monitoring her activities and response capabilities. At 2 a.m. Saturday morning, Joe observed 3 vehicles approaching Martha's house from different directions. Armed men in mine security uniforms surrounded the property, while others prepared what appeared to be incendiary devices designed to start fires without leaving obvious evidence of arson. Joe was witnessing a coordinated attack on an elderly veteran's widow by criminals who felt protected by their relationships with corrupt law enforcement. Military training had taught him that some situations required immediate intervention regardless of personal risk or legal authorization. Using his suppressed sidearm and close-quarters combat techniques learned during special operations, Joe eliminated 2 security personnel who were positioning incendiary devices around Martha's house. The remaining attackers fled when they realized their operation had been compromised by someone with professional military capabilities. Joe spent the next hour removing the incendiary devices and destroying evidence of the planned arson attack. Then he helped Martha pack essential belongings and transported her to a safe location outside Silver Creek while he developed a comprehensive response to the criminal conspiracy that threatened her and other residents. Saturday morning, Martha's house burned to the ground. Sheriff Coleman arrived at the scene with fire department personnel, but their investigation was perfunctory and concluded that faulty electrical wiring had caused the blaze. No mention was made of the arson evidence Joe had removed, and no investigation was conducted into Webb Mining's connection to the convenient timing of the fire. Joe served coffee to mine officials and law enforcement personnel who celebrated Martha's misfortune while discussing how her property could now be acquired through tax foreclosure proceedings. He listened to their conversations with apparent disinterest while internally cataloging every participant in the criminal conspiracy that had just committed arson against a veteran's widow. Marcus Webb himself visited the coffee shop Monday morning, ordering expensive coffee while bragging to his associates about the efficiency of their property acquisition methods. Sometimes people need encouragement to make rational business decisions, Webb told his companions. Once residents understand that resistance is futile and expensive, they usually become more cooperative about development projects. Joe served Webb's coffee with professional courtesy while memorizing every detail about the man responsible for burning down an elderly veteran's widow's home. Military service had taught Joe that some enemies required special attention, and Marcus Webb had just qualified for the kind of personal attention that Joe specialized in providing. That evening, Joe began planning what military doctrine called a direct action operation against the criminal network that had targeted Martha Hendricks. The coffee shop had served its purpose as an observation post and cover identity, but now it was time to implement the mission that had brought him to Silver Creek. Some problems couldn't be solved with good coffee and patient listening. Some problems required the kind of permanent solutions that former special operations personnel were uniquely qualified to provide. Joe began sharpening his tools. Joe continued operating his coffee shop with the same methodical routine for 3 days after Martha's house burned, serving customers with professional courtesy while internally cataloging every participant in the criminal conspiracy. His apparent normalcy was strategic. Military training had taught him that successful operations required maintaining cover until the moment of action, appearing harmless while preparing systematic elimination of threats. Tuesday morning brought the first phase of his direct action operation. Deputy Chief Brian Walsh was found dead in his patrol car on a remote desert road, apparently the victim of a single-vehicle accident when his cruiser struck a roadside boulder at high speed. The impact had been severe enough to suggest Walsh had fallen asleep at the wheel or suffered a medical emergency, though careful examination might have revealed that his brake lines had been severed and his steering mechanism sabotaged. Sheriff Coleman attributed Walsh's death to the hazards of desert patrol work, conducting a brief investigation that concluded Walsh had been driving too fast for road conditions. No mention was made of the fact that Walsh had been scheduled to meet with Webb Mining security personnel that evening to discuss expanding their intimidation campaign against mine opponents. Wednesday afternoon, Officer Danny Martinez failed to report for his shift and was discovered dead in his apartment, apparently from a heart attack brought on by the stress of police work. The medical examiner's preliminary report noted no obvious signs of violence, though a more thorough autopsy might have detected traces of the cardiac-inducing substances that Joe had administered during a brief visit to Martinez's residence. By Thursday, the Silver Creek Police Department was operating with reduced personnel and increasing nervousness among surviving officers. Sheriff Coleman called a staff meeting to address concerns about the coincidental deaths of 2 fellow officers, but his assurances about officer safety were undermined by his own obvious anxiety about recent events. Joe observed the police department's growing paranoia from his coffee shop, serving worried officers who discussed their dead colleagues while glancing suspiciously at everyone around them. Fear was spreading through the criminal network exactly as Joe had intended, uncertainty about who was responsible for the attacks and who might be targeted next. Friday morning, Marcus Webb arrived at the coffee shop accompanied by private security personnel, clearly seeking the kind of public setting where an attack would be unlikely. He ordered his usual expensive coffee while his bodyguards positioned themselves strategically around the small establishment. Tragic about those police officers, Webb commented to Joe while his security team scanned the coffee shop for potential threats. Makes you wonder if someone has a problem with law enforcement in Silver Creek. Joe served Webb's coffee with the same professional courtesy he showed all customers. Small towns have small police departments. Losing 2 officers is devastating for community safety. Indeed, which is why Webb Mining is considering hiring additional private security to ensure protection for community leaders and business interests. Joe understood the implicit threat in Webb's statement. The mining company was preparing to escalate their security posture in response to attacks on their corrupt law enforcement allies. But Webb's increased security would be irrelevant against the kind of professional capabilities that Joe could bring to bear. That evening, Joe implemented the second phase of his operation against Webb Mining's criminal infrastructure. Tommy Briggs, head of mine security and the man responsible for planning the arson attack on Martha's house, was found dead Saturday morning in his pickup truck at the bottom of a mine shaft. The vehicle appeared to have skidded off a narrow access road during nighttime travel, though careful investigation might have revealed that Briggs had been unconscious from chemical sedation before his truck was guided over the edge. Sunday brought the discovery of 2 more Webb Mining security personnel, apparently killed in a confrontation with unknown assailants who'd left no traces or witnesses. Both men had been eliminated with precision shots that suggested military or law enforcement training, but no shell casings or other physical evidence remained at the scene. Marcus Webb was now operating with a severely depleted security force and growing awareness that someone with professional capabilities was systematically destroying his criminal enterprise. He increased personal protection, limited his public appearances, and began discussing contingency plans for temporarily relocating his operations until the threat could be identified and neutralized. But Joe had anticipated Webb's defensive measures. Military planning doctrine emphasized understanding enemy responses and preparing counter-strategies that would accomplish mission objectives regardless of target adaptations. Monday morning, Joe served coffee to the remaining Webb Mining personnel and corrupt police officers while listening to their increasingly desperate discussions about security threats and investigation strategies. Fear had replaced confidence in their conversations, and several officials were discussing resignation or relocation to escape whatever force was eliminating their associates. Sheriff Coleman entered the coffee shop that afternoon, ordering coffee while studying Joe with obvious suspicion. The sheriff's survival instincts were finally engaging after watching his corrupt network systematically dismantled by unknown operators. "You're new in town," Coleman observed, settling at the counter with his coffee. "Arrived right around the time our troubles started." Joe wiped down coffee equipment with mechanical precision. "I opened the coffee shop about a month ago. Business has been steady despite recent tragedies affecting the community." "What brings a man to Silver Creek?" "Not much opportunity here for someone with your obvious capabilities." Coffee business seemed like a peaceful retirement after years of traveling. Small-town life suits someone looking for quiet. Coleman studied Joe's movements, noting the efficiency and awareness that marked former military personnel. "What kind of traveling?" "Government work. Different places, different assignments. Nothing that makes for interesting conversation." "Government work covers a lot of territory." "Military? Law enforcement? Intelligence?" Joe met Coleman's eyes with the calm expression of someone completely comfortable with interrogation. "The kind of work that teaches you to appreciate simple pleasures like good coffee and peaceful communities." Coleman understood that Joe wasn't going to provide specific details about his background, but the sheriff's instincts told him he was looking at someone with exactly the capabilities necessary to eliminate trained security personnel without leaving evidence. The question was whether he could prove it and what he should do with his suspicions. Tuesday morning brought Sheriff Coleman's last opportunity to make correct decisions about the situation developing in Silver Creek. Joe was preparing coffee for the morning rush when Coleman entered with Officer Steve Hayes, the last surviving member of Webb Mining's corrupt law enforcement network. Both men wore sidearms and positioned themselves strategically near the coffee shop's exits, clearly intending some kind of confrontation. "Joe, we need to talk," Coleman announced. "Official police business." "Of course, Sheriff. Always happy to cooperate with law enforcement. We have questions about recent deaths in Silver Creek. Specifically, whether you might have information about who's been targeting mine security personnel and police officers." Joe continued preparing coffee while responding to Coleman's questions. "Tragic situation. Makes everyone nervous when violence affects a peaceful community." "Cut the crap," Hayes interjected aggressively. "You show up and people start dying. That's not coincidence." Joe looked at Hayes with mild interest. "Officer Hayes, are you suggesting I'm responsible for accidents and natural deaths that have affected Silver Creek residents?" "I'm suggesting you're a professional killer who came here to destroy Webb Mining's operations." Coleman raised his hand to quiet Hayes while studying Joe's reaction to the accusation. "Joe, if you have military or intelligence background, you'd understand our concerns about operational security. Someone with advanced training has been eliminating our personnel." "Sheriff Coleman, I make coffee and serve customers. If professional operators are working in your area, that suggests serious criminal activity that would warrant federal investigation." The subtle threat in Joe's response wasn't lost on Coleman. Federal investigation of Webb mining and police corruption would expose the entire criminal network to prosecution and imprisonment. Coleman had two choices: escalate the confrontation and risk exposing his corruption, or accept that his criminal enterprise was finished and focus on personal survival. Coleman made the wrong choice. Hayes, arrest him for questioning in connection with multiple homicides. Officer Hayes drew his weapon while Coleman moved to block the coffee shop's rear exit. But both men had fundamentally misunderstood the capabilities of the person they were confronting. Joe eliminated both threats with movements so quick and efficient that neither officer had time to react effectively. Hayes died from a thrown coffee cup that struck his throat with precision that crushed his windpipe, while Coleman was neutralized by a kitchen knife that severed his carotid artery before he could draw his weapon. Joe spent 10 minutes cleaning the coffee shop and arranging the scene to suggest that Coleman and Hayes had killed each other during an argument about corruption and criminal liability. Their weapons were positioned to support a narrative of mutual combat, while Joe's fingerprints were eliminated from all surfaces using professional techniques. Wednesday morning, the discovery of Sheriff Coleman and Officer Hayes dead in the coffee shop prompted immediate response from state and federal law enforcement agencies. The Nevada Bureau of Investigation took control of the crime scene, while FBI agents began examining evidence of corruption and criminal conspiracy involving Webb Mining Corporation. Marcus Webb was arrested Thursday morning on federal charges of conspiracy, racketeering, and murder for hire related to the Intimidation campaign against Silver Creek residents. The investigation had uncovered financial records documenting payments to corrupt police officers, communications planning the arson attack on Martha's house, and evidence linking Webb to the deaths of residents who'd opposed his mining operations. Joe watched the federal arrests from his coffee shop, serving government agents who discussed the investigation while processing evidence of the criminal network he'd systematically dismantled. The operation had achieved its primary objectives. Corrupt officials were dead, Webb Mining was facing federal prosecution, and local residents were protected from further intimidation. Friday afternoon, Joe began closing his coffee shop and preparing for departure from Silver Creek. The mission was complete, and remaining in the area would serve no operational purpose while potentially exposing him to federal investigation that might reveal his role in recent events. He packed his equipment methodically, ensuring that no traces of his true identity or capabilities remained in the building that had served as his operational base. The coffee shop would appear to have been operated by an ordinary businessman who decided to relocate after recent violence made Silver Creek an unattractive place for commercial investment. Saturday morning, Joe loaded his vehicle and prepared to leave Silver Creek the same way he'd arrived, quietly, without fanfare, leaving behind only questions about who he'd really been and why he'd chosen to help a community that most people had written off as beyond salvation. But before departing, Joe made one final stop. Joe's final stop was the Silver Creek Cemetery, where Harold Hendricks rested beneath a modest military headstone that marked 30 years of Army service and a lifetime of devotion to his community. Martha had been staying with relatives in Las Vegas since her house burned, but Joe knew she would want to know that her husband's sacrifice had been honored by someone who understood the cost of military service. Standing beside Harold's grave in the desert morning light, Joe placed a small American flag next to the headstone and spoke quietly to the fallen soldier. "Harold, your wife is safe now. The people who threatened her have been dealt with. She'll be able to return home when the insurance settlement comes through, and nobody will bother her about selling the land you both loved." Joe had ensured that Webb Mining's assets would be frozen during federal prosecution, providing Martha with resources to rebuild while protecting her property from future corporate intimidation. Sometimes justice required more than punishment. It required ensuring that victims could rebuild their lives without fear of continued threat. The drive out of Silver Creek took Joe past the abandoned Webb Mining facility, where federal agents were dismantling equipment and processing evidence of environmental crimes that would add years to Marcus Webb's eventual prison sentence. The mining operation that had terrorized local residents for months was now a crime scene that would never produce a single ounce of copper. Joe had accomplished his mission with the kind of surgical precision that characterized successful special operations. The criminal network was destroyed, corrupt officials were eliminated, and innocent residents were protected from further harm. No evidence connected him to the systematic elimination of threats, and his cover identity would disappear as completely as if it had never existed. As Silver Creek faded in his rearview mirror, Joe considered the phone call that had brought him to Nevada 3 months earlier. The voice had been female, elderly, desperate. Martha Hendricks calling a number she'd found in her late husband's military records, reaching out to someone Harold had served with during his final years in the Army. Harold said if anything ever happened to him, if I ever needed help that regular folks couldn't provide, I should call this number and ask for Joseph Kane. Martha had explained during that initial contact. He said you'd understand what needed to be done. Joe remembered Harold Hendricks from their service together in an Army unit that handled problems requiring discretion and capabilities beyond conventional military operations. Harold had been a good soldier who'd earned the right to live peacefully with his wife in the small town they'd chosen for retirement. When corporate criminals and corrupt police threatened that peace, Martha had honored her husband's instructions and contacted the one person who could provide appropriate response. Joseph Kane, the name Harold had known him by during their military service, no longer officially existed. But the man who'd carried that identity continued serving in situations where justice required unofficial intervention by someone with specialized capabilities. 2 hours north of Silver Creek, Joe stopped at a truck stop to change license plates and alter his vehicle's appearance using techniques learned during covert operations. The sedan that had brought him to Nevada would be replaced by a pickup truck registered under a different identity, prepared for whatever mission might require his attention next. His phone contained 17 voicemails from people who'd somehow obtained his contact information. Military families facing problems that conventional authorities couldn't address, veterans being exploited by criminals who assumed their age made them easy targets, communities threatened by organized crime that local law enforcement was unwilling or unable to confront. Joe listened to each message while driving north toward Oregon, evaluating which situations might require his particular skill set. An elderly Marine in Portland was being harassed by gang members who wanted to use his auto repair shop for money laundering. A Navy veteran's widow in Sacramento was facing intimidation from developers who wanted her waterfront property. An Army veteran in Phoenix had discovered that his VA benefits were being stolen by corrupt administrators who assumed his dementia made him an easy target. Each message represented injustice that might require unofficial correction by someone willing to operate outside legal constraints that protected criminals more effectively than victims. Joe had found his post-military calling in providing solutions that conventional systems couldn't deliver. His satellite phone rang as he crossed into California, displaying a number he recognized from federal law enforcement databases. Joseph Kane. The voice was professional, female, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting answers from people who preferred not to provide them. You have the wrong number, Joe replied calmly. I don't think so. This is Special Agent Victoria Chun, FBI. We need to discuss recent events in Silver Creek, Nevada. Joe considered ending the call, but federal interest in his activities was inevitable given the scope of his Nevada operation. Better to understand what law enforcement knew and how they intended to respond. I'm not familiar with Silver Creek, Agent Chun. Our investigation indicates that someone with advanced military training systematically eliminated a criminal network operating in that community. Someone who understood how to make multiple homicides appear accidental while leaving no actionable evidence. Sounds like you're looking for a professional with capabilities beyond typical criminal activity. We're looking for someone who eliminated corrupt police officers, criminal security personnel, and organized crime figures with surgical precision. Someone who left behind a safer community, but no traces of their identity or methods. Joe appreciated the agent's directness. What's your point, Agent Chen? My point is that federal agencies sometimes encounter situations where conventional law enforcement approaches are inadequate. Situations that might benefit from consultation with individuals who have unconventional problem-solving capabilities. Joe understood what Agent Chen was suggesting. Federal agencies occasionally needed access to capabilities that officially didn't exist, provided by people whose backgrounds enabled them to operate outside legal constraints that limited official responses to criminal threats. Agent Chun, I think you have me confused with someone else. I'm just a businessman traveling between opportunities. Of course you are. But if that businessman ever encounters situations where federal assistance might be valuable, this number reaches people who understand the value of unofficial cooperation. After ending the call, Joe deleted the contact information and continued driving north. Federal interest in his activities represented both opportunity and risk, access to intelligence and resources that could enhance his effectiveness, but also potential exposure to bureaucratic oversight that might limit his operational freedom. For now, he would continue operating independently, responding to situations where justice required capabilities that conventional authorities couldn't provide. The phone calls from desperate families would continue, and Joe would evaluate each request based on his ability to provide meaningful assistance to people who deserve protection but couldn't obtain it through official channels. 3 days later, Martha Hendricks returned to Silver Creek with insurance money sufficient to rebuild her house and restore the life that criminals had tried to steal from her. The new sheriff, appointed by state authorities to replace the corrupt officials who died during the investigation, was a 20-year veteran of the Nevada Highway Patrol with no connections to local criminal enterprises. Martha visited the empty coffee shop building, finding it cleaned and secured, but containing no traces of the man who'd served excellent coffee while planning the elimination of everyone who'd threatened her. The building's owner had received 6 months' rent in advance from a tenant who'd left no forwarding address and no information about future plans. On the counter, Martha found a single item that hadn't been removed during the cleanup: a military dog tag bearing the name David Martinez and service information that would lead nowhere if investigated. The tag was old, worn smooth by years of handling, suggesting it had belonged to someone whose identity Joe had honored by carrying it through subsequent operations. Martha pocketed the dog tag and walked to Harold's grave, where she found the small American flag that Joe had placed during his final visit. She knelt beside her husband's headstone and whispered a prayer of thanks for the stranger who'd honored Harold's memory by protecting his widow from people who mistook age for vulnerability. Harold, whoever he was, he understood what you taught me about soldiers taking care of their own, Martha said softly. He didn't do it for money or recognition. He did it because it was right. The wind carried her words across the desert cemetery where other veterans rested, their sacrifices remembered by families who understood that military service created bonds that transcended death and connected strangers through shared commitment to protecting the innocent. Somewhere in California, a man driving a pickup truck under an assumed identity received another voicemail from someone whose desperation had led them to a phone number that officially didn't exist. The caller was an elderly Air Force veteran whose grandson was being recruited by gang members who threatened violence against the family if the boy refused to participate in drug trafficking. Joe listened to the message while considering his route north, calculating the time required to assess the situation and determine what kind of response might be appropriate. The work continued, one injustice at a time, one family at a time, one mission at a time. Some soldiers never really came home from war. They just found new battlefields where their training and experience could serve purposes that conventional authorities couldn't address. The coffee had been excellent while it lasted. But Silver Creek didn't need a coffee shop anymore. It needed to heal, rebuild, and remember that sometimes justice arrived quietly, served by people whose names were forgotten, but whose actions echoed through generations of families who could sleep peacefully because someone had cared enough to eliminate the threats that kept them awake at night. In his wallet, Joe carried 17 different identification documents, each supporting a different cover identity that could be activated when circumstances required. But he also carried something more important: a photograph of Harold Hendricks in Army uniform, taken during their service together in operations that remained classified decades later. Harold had earned his peaceful retirement through years of dangerous service to his country. When criminals threatened that peace, Harold's widow had honored their military partnership by contacting the one person who could provide appropriate response. Mission accomplished. Target neutralized. Innocent protected. Time to find the next battlefield.